everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Lord of the Rings AMA podcast. My name is Matthias Austin, and on this podcast, I invite you to ask me anything about Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or anything related to the greater legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I will do my best to give you as in-depth an answer as I can. Now, a couple of quick things up top before we get into the show. I'm going to be traveling for the next 2 weekends, and I'm not going to have the opportunity to record any episodes. Much as I might wish it was otherwise, researching and talking about Tolkien is not, in fact, my full-time job, or actually anything I get paid for at all. And this time of year, my spare time is pretty limited, so I'm just not going to have the time to get everything ready to go to record ahead of time. So we will be off for 2 weeks, and then back on December 8. But if you wake up next Monday, or, whatever day of the week you listen to the show, and you find you're just really missing my voice and some Tolkien talk, I have a few suggestions of ways that you can fill that deep void in your life. First, if you're someone who picks and chooses episodes based off of the topic of the week, and you haven't listened to the full back catalog, give it a listen to an episode that maybe you skipped the first time around. Second, you could follow me on social media. I'm going to try to remember to share some, Tolkien, Lord of the Rings memes or something on my weeks off. So follow me on social media. Third thing you can do is share the show with a Tolkien fan in your life that hasn't heard it before. And you can enjoy them listening to the show for the first time, much like, a parent enjoys watching their child open presents on Christmas Day. If you haven't done it yet, another thing you can do is to leave a 5-star rating and review saying how much you miss the show when it goes on hiatus. And, if there's some funny ones that pop up there, maybe the funniest new review that has that as a theme to it, I'll read it out on the next episode on December 8. Fifth, you can, and this is a more serious one, you could start rereading or maybe reading for the first time some of Tolkien's writings. If you've been daunted by the books in the past, maybe you've only seen the movies, or, maybe you've done The Hobbit but not Lord of the Rings, or you've done The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, but not the Silmarillion, there have been some amazing recordings done recently by Andy Serkis. He's done some audiobook recordings of The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, and yes, even the Silmarillion. And so I would say pick that up, and if you don't want to, if reading it feels a bit too much, try that audiobook. It might be a little bit less intimidating. And then the last and maybe the most important thing that you can do to stay focused on Tolkien is to think up a question for the show and submit it to lotramapod@gmail.com. Big questions or small questions, send whatever you got. And if you do send in a question to lotramapod@gmail.com, you'll be just like this week's question asker, Dexter from San Francisco. Dexter asks, "Hello, love the podcast." Well, thank you. "I'm wondering if we could get an explanation of the origin of hobbits. I know that they're related to humans, but I wonder when in the history of Middle-earth their races diverged. I'm also curious about the genealogical differences between the Harfoots, Stoors, and Fallowhides." Thank you, Dexter, for that question. Now, I'm going to do my absolute best to answer this in depth, but I have to give you a fair warning here. Much of the origin of hobbits is largely unknown. In the prologue to Lord of the Rings, Section 1, yes, this is Tolkien, so the prologue has multiple sections, and also an additional note, but in Section 1, it's titled Concerning Hobbits, and it goes into some of the history and customs of hobbits. And this prologue is honestly the first stumbling block for many new readers, especially those coming from, the quick pace of The Hobbit. So even if you've read Lord of the Rings before, you might have skipped this. Now here's how Concerning Hobbits describes, or rather doesn't describe, the origins of hobbits. "It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even than dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much of the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them, and the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. So, we know from this that hobbits, they are a branch of humanity, rather than a whole separate group like elves and dwarves. And they've been around for a while, but no one knows when this divergence happened. In Volume 12 of the History of Middle-earth, titled The Peoples of Middle-earth, in the section Of Dwarves and Men, Tolkien wrote, "In their unrecorded past they must have been a primitive, indeed a savage people, but when we meet them they had, in varying degree, acquired many arts and customs by contact with men, and to a less extent with dwarves and elves. With men of normal stature they recognized their close kinship." And in a letter to publisher Milton Waldman, whom Tolkien was attempting to pitch a deal for the combined Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings, and this obviously it didn't happen, and the publishing history of Lord of the Rings is very complicated, but in this letter to this publisher, Tolkien laid out a lot of the background for his world, and he wrote this about hobbits. "In the middle of the Third Age, the hobbits appear. Their origin is unknown even to themselves, for they escaped the notice of the great or the civilized peoples with records, and kept none themselves, save vague oral traditions until they had migrated from the borders of Mirkwood, fleeing from the shadow, and wandered westward, coming into contact with the last remnants of the kingdom of Arnor." And you do kind of have to wonder why Tolkien, who was creating this world, decided not to come up with a definitive backstory. But, like Tom Bombadil and what was behind that stupid door in the mountains, listen to the episode on the Army of the Dead for more on that, Tolkien decided to just leave it a mystery. So their primordial origins can't be pinned down, but there are some conclusions that we can draw. Now, their branching off from men likely happened in the First Age, or the Elder Days, as we see another branch of humanity in some of Tolkien's writings existing then as well, and we'll get to more on them near the end of the episode. And we know that if they're related to men, they originated far in the east and migrated, as all men did, slowly westward. And while some of the men made it all the way to Beleriand in the First Age, it seems that early hobbits settled in an area called the Vales of Anduin. Now, the Vales of Anduin is the name for the valley system of the Anduin River. It's basically the area north of Lothlorien, between Mirkwood in the east and the Misty Mountains in the west. And this was actually a very commonly populated area throughout history. It was in this land that the Nandor elves turned aside from the Great Journey in the First Age in the time of the Two Trees. Later, this land would be populated by the Northmen, the ultimate ancestors of the Woodmen, people we only get passing references to, the Beornings, or the people of Beorn, that bear man from The Hobbit, if you've read The Hobbit, and the Rohirrim, who would later be given the land of Rohan as a reward for their assistance in fighting enemies of Gondor in 2509 of the Third Age. So all of those people were descended from the Northmen who lived in that area. And we know that there must have been overlap between when the Northmen lived in the Vales of Anduin and when the Hobbits did, because we see in the Two Towers that the Rohirrim had actually heard of hobbits, but they thought they were a legend. When Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are asking Éomer if he'd seen Merry and Pippin, with the orcs, the exchange goes like this. "Halflings," laughed the rider that stood beside Éomer. "Halflings? But they are only little people in old songs and children's tales out of the north." And later, when Theoden arrives at Isengard following the Battle of Helm's Deep, he sees Merry and Pippin eating and smoking pipes among the wreckage. And this is what Theoden says. "My people came out of the north long ago," said Theoden, "but I will not deceive you. We know no tales about hobbits. All that is said among us is that far away, over many hills and rivers, live the halfling folk that dwell in holes in sand dunes. But there are no legends of their deeds, for it is said that they do little and avoid the sight of men, being able to vanish in a twinkling, and they could change their voices to resemble the piping of birds. But it seems that more could be said." "It could indeed, Lord," said Merry. "For one thing," said Theoden, I had not heard that they spouted smoke from their mouths. Which leads to a delightful conversation about the growing of pipeweed, and it's the start of the friendship that ultimately ends in heartbreak between Merry and King Theoden. And this reference to living in sand dunes is interesting because there are no deserts in the north of Middle-earth. There could be deserts out farther in the east, which makes you wonder if the Northmen had contact with hobbits at some point in their past, and the hobbits told them that they used to live in sand dunes. It's very interesting, and we have no idea why they would get that idea of sand dunes. But anyway, so the ancestors of the Rohirrim did know about hobbits, and at some point in their history, they may have lived very closely together, because their languages are very similar. In fact, in a rare instance for Tolkien, hobbits didn't actually have their own language. Tolkien didn't make one. Tolkien writes this in the appendices of Lord of the Rings. There is no record of any language peculiar to hobbits. In ancient days, they seem always to have used the languages of men near whom or among whom they lived. Thus they quickly adopted the common speech after they entered Eriador, and by the time of their settlement at Bree they had already begun to forget their former tongue. This was evidently a mannish language of the Upper Anduin, akin to that of the Rohirrim, though the southern Stures appear to have adopted a language related to Dunlendish before they came north to the Shire. Of these things, in the time of Frodo, there were still some traces left in local words and names, many of which closely resembled those found in Dale or in Rohan. Most notable were the names of days, months, and seasons. Several other words of the same sort, such as Matham and Smile, were also still in common use, while more were preserved in the place names of Bree and the Shire. The personal names of the hobbits were also peculiar, and many had come down from ancient days. Hobbit was the name usually applied by the Shire folk to all their kind. Men called them halflings, and the elves Perianath. The origin of the word hobbit was by most forgotten. It seems, however, to have been at first a name given to the Harfoots by the Fallowhides and Stures, and to be a worn-down form of a word preserved more fully in Rohan, Holbiltla, hole builder. The reason behind why they're called halflings, by the way, is Tolkien explains in one of the unfinished tales when he describes the Númenóreans meeting the hobbits. He writes, "They did not, of course, call themselves halflings. This was the Númenórean name for them. It evidently referred to their height in comparison with Númenórean men, and was approximately accurate when given." And just for the record, halflings are usually about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, meaning the men of Númenor were roughly 7 to 8 feet tall. Aragorn is about 6'6". He's clocking it at 6'6", which would be short compared to all of his ancestors. Elves were of a similar height, with the shortest female elves being no less than 6 feet, and the shortest male elves were never less than 6'6". I think the tallest elf on record was over 8 feet tall, and I'm kind of digressing here, other than to say that while the rest of the world called them halflings, hobbits called themselves hobbits, deriving from the language of the Northmen. While the Rohirrim had these myths of hobbits and secret magic creatures, it's very likely they actually lived alongside hobbits in the Vales of Anduin. In Of Dwarves and Men, Tolkien wrote, "Bilbo's statement that the cohabitation of big folk and little folk in the one settlement at Bree was peculiar and nowhere else to be found was probably true in his time, but it would seem that actually hobbits had liked to live with or near big folk of friendly kind, who with their greater strength protected them from many dangers and enemies and hostile men." And that is all we really know about the early history of hobbits, living peacefully along the banks of the Anduin River. But as all things go in Middle-earth, peace was never really long-lasting, and around the year 1050 of the Third Age, Sauron began to stir in Mirkwood. And this, combined with the increasing population of men in the area, is what prompted one of the first major recorded events in Hobbit history, called the Wandering Days, where they migrated west across the Misty Mountains and into the lands of Eriador beyond. And it is now time that we talk about the different types of Hobbit, as they all began their wandering at different times. There were essentially 3 different clans, I guess you would say. I guess you would say clans, different races of hobbits. I don't know enough about sociology to know exactly how to describe the nomenclature for groups of people, but Regardless, there's 3 types of hobbits, and they were the Harfoots, the Stewars, and the Fallowhides. And the best description of the differences between them comes from the prologue of The Lord of the Rings. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into 3 somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stewars, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stewars were broader, heavier in build, their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin, and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. And we're told that the Harfoots were the first to leave the Vales of Anduin when they met once they did, they met the Dunedain of Arnor. And again, from the prologue. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early, and roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in Wilderland, which is the Vales of Anduin. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. Most of the hobbits you see in Lord of the Rings, the hobbits of the Shire, are descended from Harfoots. So, Sam and Frodo were primarily Harfoot, though Frodo did have a strong strain of Fallowhide in him through his mother Belladonna Took. And about 100 or so years after the Harfoots leave their ancestral home, the Fallowhides and Stewars followed suit, with the Fallowhides roughly following the Harfoots on a northerly pass, while the Stewars crossed the mountains much further south, settling farther away from the others. And here's how the Fallowhides are described. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell and came down the river Horwell. In Eriador they soon mingled with other kinds that had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains among clans of Harfoots or Stewars. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallowhidish strain could still be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. And Pippin, he was definitely a Fallowhide, which might explain his more, outgoing and impulsive behavior. And the last group were the Stewars. And again, coming from the prologue, the Stewars lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots and followed the course of the Loudwater southwards, and there many of them long dwelt between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. What's most interesting about the Stewars is that, unlike the other hobbits, some did eventually return to the Vales of Anduin. In 1356, a group of Stewars returned to the river Anduin in the area of the Gladden Fields. And Tolkien, he describes this group in a draft of a letter. He didn't send the letter for some reason, but in a draft of the letter, he wrote in 1958 to A.C. Nunn. With the remigration of the Stewars back to Wilderland in Third Age 1356, all contact between this retrograde group and the ancestors of the Shire folk was broken. All hobbits were slow to change, but the remigrant Stewars were going back to a wilder and more primitive life of small and dwindling communities, while the Shire folk in the 1400 years of their occupation had developed a more settled and elaborate social life. And Smeagol and Deagol lived with this group. And it seems that sometime after Smeagol took the ring, that branch of Stewars died out completely. Christopher Tolkien noted, "In a letter written in 1959, my father said, between 2463, when Deagol the Stewar found the One Ring, according to the Tale of Years, and the beginning of Gandalf's special inquiries concerning the ring, nearly 500 years later, they, meaning the Stewars, appear indeed to have died out altogether, except, of course, for Smeagol, or to have fled from the shadow of Dol Guldur. And the Stewars that didn't go back to the Vales of Anduin, that they remained in Tharbad and Dunland, they would eventually turn north and join the Hobbits in the Shire in the year 1630. But it is possible that many Stewars still lived in this area outside of the Shire, even at the time of the Lord of the Rings. In the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien wrote The Hunt for the Ring, which was basically the Nazgul perspective on their attempt to find the Shire. And in their search, they came across Stoor villages still along the Anduin. And Tolkien wrote, Stoor settlements were not entirely deserted at that time, and such of the Stoors as dwell there were slain or driven away by the Nazgul. But the Stoors that did go to the Shire, they settled along the Brandywine River and became known as the Brandybucks, Merry's family, which means that the quartet of hobbits in The Lord of the Rings gives us a full representation of the three hobbit clans. Sam as a Harfoot, Pippin as a Fallowhide, and Merry as a Stoor. And Frodo, with Baggins, Took, and Brandybuck heritage, he really combines all three, though truthfully at this point in the Third Age, all of them likely had some connection to all of the different types of hobbits. Now, I could go more into the more recent history of hobbits, like the founding of the Shire and the few battles that they fought in, but as Dexter's question was about their origins, I think I'm going to leave it there. But I'm not done, however, talking about offshoots of the main branch of humanity in Middle-earth, because, as I said up top, hobbits are not the only small folks related to humans. We actually see these other people in Return of the King. They're called the Druedain, also known as Droog or Pookelmen. In Return of the King, the Druedain aid the Rohirrim on their way to Gondor by leading them through forests around a waiting army of orcs that had been sent to waylay them. And when Merry first sees their chief, Gon-Buri Gon, he describes him this way. Before them on the ground sat a strange squat shape of a man, gnarled as an old stone, and the hairs of his scanty beard straggled on his lumpy chin like dry moss. He was short-legged and fat-armed, thick and stumpy, and clad only with grass about his waist. And we aren't given much information about them in the main books, but in the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien gives us more about the history of these people, the Druedain. And some of their people lived in the areas around the White Mountains, where we see them in Return of the Kings. But others of the Druedain traveled into Beleriand with the people of Haleth, and lived with them in the forests of Brethil in the First Age of Middle-earth. And Tolkien describes these people living in Brethil with the people of Haleth like this. To the eyes of elves and other men they were unlovely in looks. They were stumpy, some 4 feet high, but very broad, with heavy buttocks and short thick legs. Their wide faces had deep-set eyes with heavy brows and flat noses, and grew no hair below their eyebrows, except in a few men who were proud of the distinction. A small tail of black hair in the midst of the chin. Their features were usually impassive, the most mobile being their wide mouths, and the movement of their wary eyes could not be observed save from close at hand, for they were so black that the pupils could not be distinguished. But in anger they glowed red. Their voices were deep and guttural, but their laughter was a surprise. It was rich and rolling, and set all who heard it, elves or men, laughing too, for its pure merriment untainted by scorn or malice. And this population of men, the Druedain, was never large, and they were often hunted or persecuted by other men. And in some of his writings, it seems as though Tolkien says that some of the Druedain accompanied the people of Haleth to Númenor at the end of the First Age, but they either died out there or they asked to return to Middle-earth, where their numbers dwindled until, at the time of Lord of the Rings, there were really only these isolated clans living in deep forests. Now, Tolkien was worried that readers of The Lord of the Rings would think that because both of these people, the Druedain and Hobbits, were small races of human, people would think they were related. And in a note published in the History of Middle-earth, Tolkien wrote, "The Droogs, or Pookelmen, are not, however, to be confused with or thought of as mere variant on the Hobbit theme. They were quite different in physical shape and appearance. Their average height, 4 feet, was only reached by exceptional hobbits. They were of heavier and stronger build, and their facial features were unlovely, judged by human standards. Physically, they shared the hairlessness of the lower face, but while the head hair of hobbits was abundant but close and curly, the Droogs had only sparse and lank hair on their heads, and none at all on their legs and feet. In character and temperament, they were at times merry and gay, like hobbits, but they had a grimmer side to their nature. In some ways, they resembled rather the dwarves in build and stature and endurance. Hobbits, on the other hand, were in nearly all respects normal men, but of very short stature. And this might just be me, but I don't think at any point reading Return of the King I ever thought that hobbits and the Druedain might be related, but it does speak to Tolkien's care for his world that he wanted to cover his bases just in case. And the last thing I'm going to talk about today, since this is about the origin of hobbits, is the origin of the word hobbit itself. Now, Tolkien always claimed that he never knew the word before he first wrote it down, as he was grading papers, and on a blank sheet he scribbled, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." But this is not the first recorded use of the word hobbit. In the mid-1800s, Michael Denham created a series of pamphlets describing the collected folklore of northern England. And in one pamphlet he wrote like a giant list of various spirits that were said to inhabit the world, and a segment of it went like this: Pygmies, Chitty-faces, Nixies, Ginny Burnt-tails, Dudmen, Hellhounds, Doppelgangers, Bogglebows, Bogies, Redmen, Portunes, Grants, Hobbits, Hobgoblins, and the list goes on. Additionally, in 1938, somebody wrote into The Observer, which I think is like a British newspaper, claiming that they had read a fairy tale called The Hobbit in 1904. But Tolkien claims that he had never heard of it, and in response, Tolkien wrote into The Observer saying, "I have no waking recollection of any Hobbit bogey in print by 1904. I suspect that the two hobbits are accidental homophones, and am content that they are not, it would seem, synonyms." And there are some who believe that Tolkien originally wrote about an anthropomorphic rabbit, and then changed the word to hobbit later on. But in a letter to his publisher when they were coming up with artwork for his books, Tolkien wrote, "I picture a fairly human figure, not a kind of fairy rabbit as some of my British reviewers seem to fancy." And he would always claim that the Hobbit was a term of his own invention. Though we should maybe look critically at it, and at least admit it's possible, just possible, he had stumbled across the word at one point or another, and it just stuck in his subconscious. Well, there you go, Dexter. I hope that answered your question about hobbits and the differences between them. And if you, like Dexter, would like to send in a question, email me at lotramapod@gmail.com. Like I said up top, I will be off for 2 weeks, so stay subscribed so you don't miss an episode, and follow me on all the socials. I'm on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube. Links for all of those are in the show notes. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and review, and if it's a funny one, I might just read it on the next show. Thank you as always to Michael for our music and Lauren for our artwork, and that's all for this week. Iluvatar willing, I'll be back on December 8. See you then.